I'm 72 years old, and in all my decades of living, I never thought I'd experience anything more humiliating than being physically pushed aside by my own daughter-in-law in front of my entire family. But that's exactly what happened last Tuesday evening at what was supposed to be a celebration dinner for my son Trevor's promotion. Picture this. I'm standing at the dining room table in my son's house, the house I helped him buy, though he'd forgotten that detail, trying to serve the apple pie I'd spent all afternoon baking. My hands were full, balancing the serving knife and plates, when Veronica came up behind me and literally placed her hands on my shoulders and shoved me to the side. "Move over, Ruth," she said, not even trying to lower her voice. "The adults need to discuss Trevor's new position, and we don't need you hovering around the table like some kind of servant." The words hit me like a physical slap, but it was the casual cruelty in her tone that really took my breath away. Like I was nothing more than an inconvenient piece of furniture that needed to be repositioned. The silence that followed was deafening. 12 family members sitting around that table. Trevor's cousins, his Uncle Patrick, even the neighbors who'd been invited, and not one person said a word. They all just stared at their plates like they hadn't witnessed a grown woman physically displacing her elderly mother-in-law at a family gathering. My son Trevor looked up at me with this expression of embarrassed annoyance, as if I was the one who'd created an awkward situation. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, holding that pie knife, feeling more invisible and unwanted than I had since my husband died 15 years ago. The apple pie I'd made with love suddenly felt heavy in my hands, and I could feel heat rising in my cheeks as the reality hit me. I had become the unwelcome relative, the burden they tolerated out of obligation rather than love. But here's what makes this story so much more than just another tale of family disrespect. If you're someone who believes that kindness and family loyalty should be treasured, then you absolutely need to subscribe to this channel right now, because what happened next will restore your faith in justice. What none of them knew was that I had something in my purse sitting right there on the kitchen counter, legal documents that would change everything in the next 5 minutes. Veronica thought she was pushing around a powerless old woman, but she was about to discover that some grandmothers have more strength than anyone realizes. And sometimes the person you dismiss as harmless is actually the one holding all the cards. Let me take you back to the beginning of that evening, because the push wasn't where Veronica's cruelty started. It was just where it reached its most obvious peak. Trevor had invited the whole family to celebrate his promotion to regional manager at the insurance company where he'd worked for 8 years. I'd been so proud when he called to tell me the news, and even prouder when he asked me to bring my famous apple pie for dessert. I arrived at 6:30 with that pie still warm from the oven, wearing my best navy dress and the pearl earrings Trevor's father had given me for our 20th anniversary. Veronica answered the door in a designer cocktail dress that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check, and her greeting was about as warm as a January morning. "Oh, Ruth, you're early." The dinner table was set beautifully. Veronica always did have excellent taste in entertaining, with cloth napkins, wine glasses, and centerpieces that looked like they belonged in a magazine. But as the evening progressed, I noticed something that made my stomach clench with growing anxiety. Every conversation seemed to flow around me like I was a stone in a stream. When Trevor's cousin Jessica asked about vacation plans, Veronica answered for the whole family without even glancing in my direction. When Uncle Patrick brought up holiday arrangements, Trevor and Veronica exchanged looks that clearly communicated decisions had already been made without consulting the woman who'd hosted Christmas dinner for 37 consecutive years. I felt like I was watching my own family through a window, present but not really included. The breaking point came during dessert service. I'd gotten up to cut the apple pie, my contribution to this celebration, when Veronica suddenly appeared beside me at the serving station. "Actually, Ruth," she said in that sugar-sweet voice that always made my skin crawl, "I think the adults want to have a serious conversation about Trevor's career opportunities. This promotion might mean relocating, and we need to discuss logistics without," she paused dramatically, looking me up and down, "without distractions." I blinked at her, not immediately understanding what she was suggesting. "I'm just serving dessert, dear." I'll sit quietly while you talk. But Veronica's expression hardened into something I'd never seen before. Ruth, I need you to understand something. This is about Trevor's future, about building wealth and security for our children. It's not really appropriate for you to be part of these discussions. That's when she put her hands on my shoulders, not gently, not apologetically, but with firm, deliberate pressure, and physically moved me away from the table. Move over, Ruth, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The adults need to discuss Trevor's new position, and we don't need you hovering around the table like some kind of servant. The silence that followed was absolutely devastating. 12 pairs of eyes looked everywhere except at me, at their wine glasses, at the ceiling, at their hands folded in their laps. Trevor's face went red, but not with anger at his wife's treatment of his mother. No, he looked embarrassed by me, as if I was the one who'd committed some social breach by trying to participate in my own family celebration. Uncle Patrick cleared his throat and mumbled something about needing another drink. Jessica suddenly became fascinated by her phone. The neighbors, people I'd known for 15 years, studied their dessert plates like they contain the secrets of the universe. Not one person in that room defended me or even acknowledged that what had just happened was wrong. But Veronica wasn't finished. As I stood there holding the pie server, feeling like I might collapse from humiliation, she turned to the table with a bright smile and said, "Now, where were we? Trevor, tell everyone about the salary increase in the company car." Her voice was cheerful, conversational, as if she hadn't just publicly declared that her husband's mother was too irrelevant to participate in family discussions. That's when I realized this wasn't just disrespect. This was a calculated power play. Veronica had been systematically erasing me from family decisions for months, and tonight was her public declaration that the process was complete. In front of witnesses, she'd established herself as the family matriarch and relegated me to the status of unwelcome outsider. She thought she'd won. She thought she'd finally put the meddling mother-in-law in her place and secured her position as the undisputed authority in Trevor's life. What she didn't realize was that she'd just made the biggest miscalculation of her entire manipulative existence. Standing there in that dining room, holding a pie server while my family pretended I didn't exist, my mind flashed back to a rainy Tuesday morning 43 years ago when everything in my world changed forever. Trevor was only 4 years old when his father was killed in that construction accident, a scaffold collapse that took 3 men and left 3 families shattered. I remember sitting in the hospital waiting room, still wearing my waitress uniform from the night shift, holding Trevor's tiny hand while doctors explained that I was now a widow at 29. What followed were years that I wouldn't wish on anyone, working double shifts at the diner during the day, cleaning office buildings at night, and spending every weekend doing alterations and mending for neighbors to scrape together enough money for rent and groceries. Trevor never knew how many nights I went to bed hungry so he could have seconds at dinner, or how many times I wore the same 3 dresses to work while making sure his school clothes were always clean and pressed. I remember sitting at our tiny kitchen table at 2 in the morning, hand-stitching patches on Trevor's jeans because I couldn't afford to buy him new ones. I remember walking to the library with him every Saturday because we couldn't afford books, teaching him to love learning while my feet ached from standing on them for 14 hours straight. When other kids got new bicycles for Christmas, I spent weeks secretly repairing and repainting an old one I'd found at a garage sale, watching his face light up Christmas morning like I'd given him the world. High school was when the real sacrifices began. Trevor was brilliant, straight A's, honor society, college potential written all over him, but college meant money we simply didn't have. I took a 3rd job cleaning houses on weekends, sold everything of value I owned, including my wedding ring, and even took out loans against my life insurance policy to make sure that boy could attend the state university and study business like he'd always dreamed. For 4 years, I lived on pasta and peanut butter sandwiches while sending Trevor care packages filled with home-baked cookies and spending money I couldn't afford. I wore the same winter coat for 8 years and never bought myself anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. But Trevor graduated debt-free with a business degree and opportunities I'd never had. The day he walked across that stage, I cried harder than I had since his father's funeral, but these were tears of joy and pride. When Trevor introduced me to Veronica 5 years ago, I was genuinely excited. My son was successful, confident, and ready to build a family of his own. Veronica was beautiful, educated, articulate, everything I'd hoped Trevor would find in a partner. I welcomed her into our family with open arms, sharing family recipes, telling her stories about Trevor's childhood, offering to help with wedding planning. But somewhere between the engagement and the wedding, things started to shift. Veronica began making subtle comments about outdated traditions and modern approaches to family life. Family dinners became less frequent, always scheduled around Veronica's work events or social commitments. When they bought their house, I offered to help with decorating and was politely told they preferred to create their own aesthetic. The grandchildren, beautiful twin boys who are now 7, became increasingly distant. Veronica enrolled them in so many activities that finding time for visits with Grandma became logistically challenging. My homemade birthday cakes were replaced with professionally decorated ones from expensive bakeries. My bedtime stories were deemed less educational than the tablet programs Veronica preferred. Standing in that dining room, I finally understood what had been happening. This wasn't just about different generational approaches to family life. This was systematic erasure. Veronica had been methodically removing my influence, my traditions, my very presence from Trevor's life. Every excluded conversation, every polite deflection, every subtle criticism had been building toward this moment, where she could publicly declare me irrelevant. But what hurt most wasn't Veronica's cruelty, it was Trevor's silence. This was the boy I'd sacrificed everything for, the man whose success had been built on the foundation of my love and determination. And he sat there, embarrassed not by his wife's treatment of his mother, but by his mother's continued existence in his carefully curated life. I realized that to Veronica, I represented everything she wanted to escape: working-class background, financial struggle, unfashionable practicality. My presence reminded Trevor of where he'd come from, and apparently that was no longer compatible with where he was going. I had become an inconvenient reminder of a past they preferred to forget. 43 years of sacrifice, love, and dedication had been reduced to this: standing in my son's house, holding a pie I'd made with love, being treated like an unwelcome stranger while my family discussed their future as if I didn't exist. I felt smaller and more invisible than I had ever felt in my life. But as I stood there absorbing the full weight of their dismissal, my hand instinctively moved toward my purse sitting on the kitchen counter. Inside that purse were documents that would remind everyone in that room exactly who they were dealing with, and exactly how much power this supposedly irrelevant old woman actually possessed. I excused myself from that dining room with as much dignity as I could muster, walking slowly toward the guest bathroom while Veronica's cheerful voice resumed discussing Trevor's career prospects behind me. But instead of going to the bathroom, I slipped into Trevor's home office, a room I'd helped him set up when they first moved in, back when my opinions still mattered. I closed the door softly and stood there in the darkness for a moment, my hands trembling not from age but from pure, concentrated fury. The moonlight streaming through the window illuminated Trevor's diplomas on the wall. Diplomas that existed because I'd worked myself to the bone to pay for his education. Every achievement certificate, every professional award, every symbol of success in that room was built on the foundation of my sacrifice. I caught my reflection in the dark computer screen and saw something that shocked me. I looked defeated. My shoulders were slumped, my face drawn with hurt, my entire posture screaming victim. When had I become this person? When had I allowed myself to shrink so small that a woman half my age could push me around in front of my own family? This wasn't who I was. I was the woman who'd faced down bill collectors and landlords when Trevor was small. I was the woman who'd worked 3 jobs and still found energy to help with homework every night. I was the woman who'd stood up to school bullies, difficult bosses, and anyone else who threatened my child's well-being. I had fought battles that would have broken weaker people, and I'd won every single one of them. But somewhere along the way, I'd confused being a loving mother with being a doormat. I'd mistaken keeping peace in the family with accepting disrespect. I'd thought that being gracious meant allowing myself to be erased from my own son's life, one small humiliation at a time. That's when I remembered the envelope in my purse. I'd brought it tonight, intending to give it to Trevor as part of his promotion celebration, a gesture of love and support that I'd thought would make him proud of his mother's foresight and generosity. Now, standing in his office while he allowed his wife to treat me like hired help, I realized that envelope represented something much more powerful than a gift. I walked back to the kitchen where my purse sat on the counter, my steps steadier than they'd been all evening. My fingers found the manila envelope immediately. I'd been carrying it for 3 days, waiting for the right moment to present it. The papers inside rustled softly as I pulled them out, and just touching them made me feel stronger. These weren't just documents. They were proof of my continued relevance, evidence that the woman Veronica had just dismissed as irrelevant actually held more power in this situation than anyone realized. For 2 years, I'd kept this information private, thinking it was better to let Trevor believe he was completely independent and self-sufficient. Tonight, I realized that my discretion had been mistaken for weakness. I could hear Veronica's voice from the dining room, explaining to the gathered family how the promotion might require relocating to a bigger city, how they'd need to make difficult decisions about family obligations in the coming months. The implication was clear. Grandmother Ruth would be left behind while they pursued bigger and better opportunities. What she didn't realize was that her plans for the future depended entirely on the cooperation of the woman she'd just humiliated. The house they were sitting in, the security they took for granted, the very foundation of their comfortable life, all of it was about to be revealed as far more complicated than they'd ever imagined. I folded the papers carefully and walked back toward the dining room, my chin higher than it had been all evening. 43 years of being a loving, supportive mother was about to be balanced by 5 minutes of being a woman who refused to be pushed around by anyone. They thought dinner was over, but the real meal was just about to be served. I walked back into that dining room with the manila envelope in my hands, and the conversation stopped mid-sentence. Veronica looked at me with barely concealed irritation, probably expecting another attempt to serve dessert or clear plates. Trevor glanced up with that same embarrassed expression, as if my mere presence was somehow socially awkward. The rest of the family sat there uncomfortably, still pretending they hadn't witnessed my public humiliation 20 minutes earlier. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I said, my voice steadier than it had been all evening, "but I think there's something we need to discuss before any major life decisions are made." I placed the envelope on the table directly in front of Trevor, right next to his wine glass. "This was supposed to be part of your promotion celebration gift, but given tonight's conversation about relocating and making difficult decisions about family obligations, I think it's time we cleared up a few misconceptions." Veronica's eyes narrowed as she looked at the envelope. "Ruth, whatever this is, it really isn't appropriate to interrupt adult conversation with—" But I held up my hand, and something in my expression made her stop talking immediately. For the first time all evening, I had everyone's complete attention. "Trevor, sweetheart," I said, looking directly into my son's eyes, "do you remember when you and Veronica were house hunting 5 years ago? You'd found this beautiful place, but were heartbroken because the down payment was just out of reach. You called me crying, saying you'd have to settle for something smaller, further from the city." Trevor's face flushed slightly. "Mom, you don't need to—" But I continued, my voice gentle but firm. "You remember how grateful you were when I offered to help? How relieved you looked when I said I could provide the additional funds you needed to make your dream house a reality?" I opened the envelope and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, spreading them carefully on the table where everyone could see the official letterheads and notary seals. "What you might not remember, son, is exactly how we structured that financial assistance. You were so excited about getting the house, and Veronica was so focused on decorating plans, that I don't think either of you paid close attention to the legal paperwork." The room had gone completely silent, except for the sound of papers rustling as I arranged the documents. Trevor leaned forward, his face confused and increasingly concerned. "Mom, what are you talking about? You gave us gift money for the down payment. We've thanked you 100 times. Actually, sweetheart, I didn't give you gift money." I pointed to the first document, a property deed with multiple names listed. "I provided a loan secured by partial ownership of the property. According to these legal documents, I own 60% of this house. You and Veronica own 40% jointly." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Trevor's face went from confused to pale to something approaching panic as he grabbed the documents and started reading. Veronica's wineglass stopped halfway to her lips, her face frozen in an expression of absolute disbelief. "The loan was structured with extremely favorable terms," I continued, my voice calm and businesslike. "No interest, no monthly payments required. Full ownership would transfer to you upon my death, or if you chose to pay back the principal amount of $180,000. I paused to let that number sink in. Of course, with property appreciation over the past 5 years, my 60% stake is now worth considerably more than my original investment. Uncle Patrick, who worked in real estate, was the first to fully grasp the implications. "Ruth," he said slowly, "are you saying that legally this house belongs more to you than to Trevor and Veronica?" I nodded calmly. "That's exactly what I'm saying. All legally documented, filed with the county, completely above board." Veronica's face had gone from pale to greenish as the reality hit her. The woman she'd just publicly dismissed as irrelevant actually owned the majority stake in her home. Every mortgage payment they'd been making for 5 years had been building equity that belonged primarily to the mother-in-law she'd been systematically trying to erase from their lives. "Now," I said, settling back in my chair with more confidence than I'd felt in months, "let's return to that interesting conversation about relocating for Trevor's promotion, and those difficult decisions about family obligations that apparently need to be made without consulting me." Trevor's hands were shaking as he flipped through page after page of legal documentation. Loan agreements, property deeds, county filings, all bearing his signature alongside mine. "Mom, I thought, why didn't you ever mention this arrangement? I assumed the house was ours, free and clear except for the mortgage." "I never mentioned it because I never intended to use it," I replied honestly. "This was supposed to be a safety net, a way to help you while protecting my own financial security in retirement. I plan to transfer full ownership to you gradually, maybe as an inheritance gift over time. I certainly never expected to need these documents to prove my relevance in my own family's life." The transformation in the room was immediate and stunning. Suddenly, every family member was looking at me with new respect and attention. The woman who'd been pushed aside 20 minutes earlier was now revealed as the person who literally owned the roof over their heads. Veronica's carefully constructed hierarchy had just collapsed entirely. "So, Veronica," I said, turning to face my daughter-in-law directly, "before we continue discussing plans that involve excluding me from family decisions, perhaps we should acknowledge that some family members might have more input into those decisions than others initially realized." The hunter had just discovered she was actually the prey, and the hunting season was about to begin. I walked back into that dining room carrying those papers like they were made of gold, and the conversation immediately stopped. 12 pairs of eyes turned toward me as I stood at the head of the table, the same spot where Veronica had pushed me aside 20 minutes earlier. But this time, I wasn't holding a pie server. I was holding documentation that would change everything they thought they knew about their comfortable little family hierarchy. "Trevor, honey," I said, my voice steady as granite, "before we finish celebrating your promotion, there's something we need to discuss. Something I probably should have mentioned years ago, but I thought it was better to let you feel independent and successful on your own merits." I placed the manila envelope on the table directly in front of him, noting how Veronica's face immediately shifted from smugness to curiosity. Trevor looked at the envelope like it might contain a bomb. Mom, what is this? We're trying to have a family celebration here. His tone carried just enough irritation to let me know that even now, after everything, he still saw me as an interruption to his important life, rather than the foundation it was built on. Open it, I said simply. I think everyone here should understand exactly who owns what in this beautiful house where we're having such a lovely dinner. The word owns hung in the air like a lightning bolt, and I watched as comprehension began to dawn on several faces around that table. Uncle Patrick leaned forward slightly. Jessica put down her wine glass. Even the neighbors seemed to sense that something significant was about to unfold. Trevor's hands shook slightly as he opened the envelope and pulled out the first document, a property deed with both our names on it. His face went white as he read the ownership percentages. Ruth Elizabeth Hoffman, 60%, Trevor Michael Hoffman, 40%. The second document was a promissory note for $87,000, signed by Trevor himself, acknowledging my gift toward his down payment as actually a loan with specific terms and conditions. What the hell is this? Veronica's voice cut through the silence like a knife, but for the first time all evening, she wasn't speaking with authority. She was speaking with fear. She grabbed the papers from Trevor's trembling hands and read them herself, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally, dawning horror. When Trevor and Veronica bought this house 3 years ago, I said, addressing the entire table like I was giving a presentation, they needed $90,000 for the down payment. Trevor came to me, stressed and worried about not qualifying for the mortgage he wanted, so I liquidated my retirement savings and gave him what he needed. Now, I could have made it a gift, I continued, watching Veronica's face grow paler by the second. But my late husband always taught me that business arrangements should be documented properly, even among family. So we structured it as a joint ownership arrangement. I own 60% of this house because I provided 60% of the initial investment. The mortgage payments Trevor's been making have been going toward purchasing my share gradually. Trevor finally found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. Mom, I thought... You said it was a gift to help us get started. I never thought... He trailed off as the full implications began to sink in. The house he'd been so proud of owning, the equity he'd been building, the security he'd thought he'd created for his family, all of it was actually a business partnership with the woman his wife had just publicly humiliated. Veronica was frantically reading through the documents, looking for some loophole or misunderstanding that would make this nightmare go away. This can't be legal, she said, her voice rising with desperation. You can't own our house without telling us. Trevor, tell her this is some kind of mistake. Ooh, but it is legal, I said, pulling out the third document. A letter from my attorney confirming the validity of all arrangements and outlining my rights as majority owner. I have the right to occupy the property, to make decisions about modifications or improvements, and, most importantly, to initiate sale proceedings if I feel my investment is being threatened or undervalued. The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. Uncle Patrick was staring at the documents with something approaching awe. Jessica had her hand over her mouth in shock. The neighbors looked like they wished they could disappear into their chairs. But Trevor, my successful independent son, who'd just been promoted to regional manager, looked like a man who'd just discovered he'd been living in a house of cards that his mother could collapse with a single phone call. You see, I continued, my voice still calm but carrying new authority, when Veronica pushed me away from this table and declared that adults were talking business, she forgot to check who actually owns the table she was talking at. This promotion celebration? It's happening in a house that belongs more to me than to either of you. Veronica's designer dress suddenly looked like a costume, her confident demeanor replaced by barely controlled panic. The woman who'd been so certain of her power in this family had just discovered she'd been insulting the person who actually held the deed to her security. Her calculation about family hierarchy hadn't just been wrong. Trevor was reading through the promissory note terms, his face growing more ashen as he realized the full scope of the arrangement. According to the documents, he still owed me $63,000, and the monthly payments he thought were building his equity were actually just rent on the portion of the house I owned. "So," I said, folding my hands and looking around the table at my suddenly very attentive family, "now that everyone understands the actual financial structure of this household, perhaps we can continue our discussion about Trevor's promotion and what decisions will be made about the future." The woman who'd been pushed aside as irrelevant had just proven she was the most powerful person in the room, and everyone knew it. The silence in that dining room stretched on for what felt like an eternity before I decided it was time to address the elephant that Veronica had put in the room. I looked directly at my daughter-in-law, who was still clutching those legal documents like they might somehow change if she stared at them hard enough, and spoke with a clarity that surprised even me. "Veronica," I said, my voice carrying the weight of 3 years of accumulated slights and dismissals, "you just spent the evening treating me like an unwelcome guest in what you believed was your home. You physically pushed me away from a table in a house that I legally own the majority of. You declared that adults were having conversations that weren't appropriate for me to hear in a dining room that exists because of my financial investment." Her face had gone from pale to red to a mottled combination of both as the full scope of her miscalculation became clear. "Ruth, we didn't know. Trevor never told me about the ownership arrangement." But I held up my hand, the same gesture that had silenced her earlier, and she stopped talking immediately. "For 3 years, you've been systematically removing me from family decisions," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "Holiday plans made without consulting me, grandchildren's activities scheduled so I can't attend, family traditions dismissed as outdated and irrelevant. Tonight was just the culmination of a campaign to erase me from my own son's life." Trevor finally found his voice, though it came out weak and defensive. "Mom, we never meant to, you're being dramatic." But I turned to look at my son, this man I'd sacrificed everything to raise, and saw something in his face that broke my heart all over again. Even now, faced with documented proof of my financial contribution to his life, he was more concerned with defending his wife than acknowledging his mother. "Dramatic?" I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Trevor, your wife just publicly humiliated me in front of our entire family. She physically moved me away from a celebration in my own house, declared me irrelevant to discussions about your future, and treated me like hired help that had forgotten its place. And you sat there and said nothing." The rest of the family was watching this confrontation like spectators at a tennis match, their heads turning back and forth as the power dynamics in the room completely shifted. Uncle Patrick cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Ruth, maybe we should discuss this privately." But I wasn't finished. Not even close. "Since Veronica seems to think this house belongs to her," I said, spreading the documents across the table where everyone could see them clearly, "let me explain exactly what these papers mean for everyone's future plans." I pointed to the promissory note. "Trevor still owes me $63,000 on the original loan. The mortgage he's been paying covers the bank's portion, but my investment has been accumulating interest at market rates." Veronica's face went white as she realized the implications. "You can't, you wouldn't actually, Trevor, tell her she can't do this." But Trevor was staring at the documents like they were written in a foreign language. The promotion he'd been so proud of, the financial security he'd thought he'd built, the independence he'd believed he'd achieved, all of it was suddenly revealed as illusion built on his mother's foundation. "Oh, but I can," I said, my voice carrying an authority I hadn't felt in years. "As majority owner, I have several options. I can demand immediate payment of the outstanding loan balance. I can initiate sale proceedings and force you to buy out my share at current market value. Or—" I paused, letting the weight of that word settle over the room like a thundercloud. "Or we can renegotiate the terms of our arrangement based on a new understanding of mutual respect and family inclusion." I looked around the table at faces that were now hanging on my every word. "But that renegotiation would require some significant changes in how this family operates." I turned back to Veronica, who looked like she was about to be sick. First, there will be no more family decisions made without consulting me. No more relocations discussed as if my opinion is irrelevant. No more treating the woman who owns this house like an unwelcome burden. My voice was calm, but every word carried the weight of legal backing. Second, I continued, my relationship with my grandchildren will be restored to what it was before you decided I was a negative influence. Weekly dinners, overnight visits, involvement in their activities and education. I will not be relegated to birthday cards and awkward holiday phone calls. Trevor was frantically calculating numbers in his head, probably trying to figure out how they could possibly buy out my share of the house on his salary. Mom, please, we can work something out. Veronica didn't mean. She was just stressed about the promotion But his voice trailed off as he realized how weak his excuses sounded. Third, I said, ignoring Trevor's stammering, there will be a public acknowledgement of what happened here tonight. Not to humiliate anyone, but to establish clear boundaries about respect and family hierarchy. Veronica will apologize for her behavior, and we will all agree on new family dynamics that include rather than exclude me. Veronica was staring at me like I'd suddenly grown fangs and claws. The woman who'd been so confident in her power 30 minutes earlier was now faced with the choice between swallowing her pride or losing her home. Of course we can discuss, she stammered, but the words came out hollow and desperate. The alternative, I said, my voice soft but implacable, is that I exercise my legal rights as majority owner and make decisions about this property's future without consulting anyone. And given tonight's demonstration of how little my presence is valued here, those decisions might not align with your relocation plans or career ambitions. The hunter had become the hunted, the dismissed elder had revealed herself as the one holding all the cards, and the family hierarchy had been completely and permanently reversed. Veronica's calculation about power and control hadn't just been wrong, it had been catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. Sometimes the most devastating victories are won not with violence or cruelty, but with simple, documented truth delivered at exactly the right moment by exactly the right person. That was 6 months ago, and I'm sitting here today in my same kitchen, the one where I spent all afternoon baking that apple pie, but everything else about my life has changed completely. The legal documents are now safely filed away in my attorney's office, but their impact continues to ripple through our family in ways that have surprised everyone, including me. The first change happened within a week of that dinner. Trevor called me every single day for 10 days straight, not with the obligatory check-ins I'd grown accustomed to, but with real conversations about real things. He wanted to understand how I'd managed the financial arrangements, why I'd structured them the way I had, and most importantly, why I'd never mentioned them before that night. "Mom," he said during one of those calls, his voice heavy with shame. "I've been thinking about how I acted that night, and I realize I haven't been the son you deserved. I got so caught up in trying to impress Veronica and her family that I forgot who actually made my success possible." Those words meant more to me than any financial acknowledgement ever could. Veronica's change was more dramatic and honestly more satisfying to witness. The woman who'd pushed me aside like furniture suddenly became intensely interested in my opinions about everything from dinner menus to weekend plans. Her phone calls started including phrases like, "What do you think, Ruth?" and "We'd love to have your input on this decision." The apology came 3 weeks after the dinner, delivered in front of the same family members who'd witnessed my humiliation. Veronica stood in my living room, my legally documented living room, and acknowledged that she'd been disrespectful, dismissive, and wrong about my role in their family. It wasn't the most gracious apology I'd ever received, but it was public, specific, and accompanied by genuine changes in behavior. But the most beautiful transformation has been with my grandsons, Lucas and Mason. Without Veronica's subtle interference, our relationship returned to what it had been before. Weekly sleepovers, baking sessions, story time, and long conversations about everything from dinosaurs to dreams. Last month, Lucas told me I was his favorite person in the whole world, and Mason asked if he could learn to make my apple pie recipe. The house itself feels different now, too. When I walk through those rooms, I'm not a tolerated guest anymore. I'm family returning home. Veronica has quietly rearranged things to include some of my photographs and small decorations. The guest room has been permanently designated as Grandma's room, complete with my favorite reading chair and a bookshelf for the novels I'm always bringing over. As for the financial arrangements, we've renegotiated them in a way that benefits everyone. Trevor is gradually buying out my ownership share through increased monthly payments that he can afford with his promotion salary. By the time he's 50, he'll own the house free and clear, and I'll have a steady retirement income that ensures my financial security for the rest of my life. What strikes me most about these past 6 months is how much clearer family communication has become. Without the undercurrent of dismissal and manipulation, we actually talk about things that matter. Trevor asks my advice about parenting decisions. Veronica includes me in holiday planning. The boys know they can come to me with problems or excitement without having to navigate complicated family politics. I'd learned something important about myself, too. I'd confused being loving with being passive. For years, I thought being a good mother and grandmother meant accepting whatever treatment I received with grace and silence. But that dinner taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stand up for yourself and demand the respect that preserves family relationships rather than enabling their destruction. The promotion Trevor was so excited about turned out to be even better than expected. Instead of requiring relocation, the company decided to expand their regional operations and keep him here. Veronica's marketing career has flourished too, partly because she no longer has to spend emotional energy on family manipulation and can focus on actual professional achievement. Perhaps most surprisingly, Veronica and I have developed something approaching genuine friendship. Without the power struggle between us, we've discovered we actually have things in common: love for Trevor and the boys, appreciation for well-designed homes, even similar tastes in books and movies. She'll never be the daughter I might have hoped for, but she's become a daughter-in-law I can respect and work with. These days, family dinners happen twice a week: Sundays at Trevor's house and Wednesdays at mine. The conversations flow naturally, the children laugh freely, and nobody gets pushed away from tables or excluded from discussions. My apple pies are once again welcome at celebrations, and my opinions are sought rather than tolerated. That manila envelope full of legal documents taught everyone in my family a valuable lesson. Never underestimate the power of a woman who's learned to document her worth and demand the respect she's earned. Sometimes the most effective way to preserve family love is to establish clear boundaries about family respect. And sometimes the best gift you can give your family is showing them that dignity and kindness aren't the same thing as weakness and submission. I'm sharing this story with you today because I know there are grandmothers, grandfathers, and elderly family members watching this who recognize the pain of being pushed aside, dismissed, or treated like burdens by the very people they've sacrificed everything to support. If my experience resonates with you, I need to hear from you in the comments below. Have you been systematically excluded from family decisions by sons or daughters who've forgotten where their opportunities came from? Maybe a daughter-in-law or son-in-law who treats you like an outdated inconvenience? Perhaps you've been physically or emotionally pushed aside at family gatherings while everyone pretends it's normal. Share your stories, the warning signs you noticed, the moments you realized you were being erased, and most importantly, how you fought back, or planned to fight back. Your experiences in the comments help other elderly family members recognize these patterns before they become entrenched. Every story shared is another family warned, another manipulation scheme exposed, another Veronica stopped before she can complete her campaign of systematic exclusion. We protect each other by speaking truth about family dynamics that often get hidden behind polite silence. If watching Veronica's complete miscalculation about family power was as satisfying to you as living through it was for me, if you believe that people who dismiss elderly family members deserve every consequence they get, then you absolutely must subscribe to this channel right now, because let me tell you something. Financial manipulation in families isn't the only battle I've won in my 72 years. I have decades of stories about people who thought my age made me powerless, who assumed that being a grandmother meant being naive about money, legal rights, and family politics. They all learned the same lesson Veronica learned. Underestimating an elderly woman who's had decades to learn how the world really works can be the costliest mistake of your entire life. Until next time, remember this: your sacrifices have value, your experience has power, and your right to respect isn't negotiable. The people who truly love you will never ask you to accept humiliation for the sake of family peace. Anyone who demands that acceptance doesn't deserve either your silence or your compliance. And always remember, sometimes the most important documents aren't the ones that prove what you've given, but the ones that prove what you still own.